I get like you're. So I've been openly a big critic of the tech industry. So my first book that I wrote about Brexit was very much focused on how, Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, Google are sort of slowly destroying our society. um, but it seems like you're basically saying that you believe that they're like the small fries here in terms of who is causing the most damage to the economy and to the wider sort of prosperity of the nation. Which is a really interesting perspective, and not one that I've heard expressed very much. Like, I mean, I've seen people sort of vilify the two of them in isolation, but I've never seen anyone come out and say, look, like, the finance industry is just demonstrably worse. Do you feel like...
Yeah. I mean, at this point, I guess in Amazon's not small fry anymore, nor is Google, but I just think, again, I think it's fair to critique both. If one reads what I write, I critique them. I mean, I think it's fair to critique them, but I just think they're the bad guys. Not when you compare them to who are the real bad guys, in my view, or some of. I'm sure there's bad guys I don't know about, but the bad guys I focus on are very, very big. They're behind the scenes, but they're very big, very powerful, and I think once one studies them. So in the book, at the end, there's an appendix. Few people will read the appendix. That's okay. But the appendix shows, I took a study of the biggest buyouts of the 80s, the 90s, and 2000s. And you find, in about half the time, if you go through each decade, these companies end up bankrupt. And these are the biggest LBOs. This is Caesars, the large gaming company. Important companies like Energy Future Holdings that provides energy for Texas. These are big, important companies, and about half of them end up going, well, half of them in the 2000s and in the 80s went bankrupt. And the biggest buyouts of the 90s, they did not go bankrupt because the economy was booming. But if you compared them against their peers did much, much better in most of the cases. In 6 cases I found in the 90s, the peers clearly grew while the PE-owned companies did not. 3 cases were mixed. In 1 case, I think the PE firm helped the business. But generally, it's just But generally, it's very destructive. There was a World Economic Forum or Davos study conducted by a private equity big shot, Joe Rice, Clayton Dublier and Rice, that was supposed to exonerate the industry, and it did exactly the opposite. So it was kind of hidden, or at least somewhat hidden. But it showed the PE firms lay off a lot of people compared to their peers, maybe 6-7% of workers over 4 to 5 years. And again, from my work, they don't improve the earnings. They may improve the earnings short term, but if you look in a real world life, do they improve their companies compared to their peers? It's not even a wash. They clearly do worse.
Okay. Yeah, because I guess that's what you're looking for in a company. You want them to grow, be more prosperous. You obviously want them to profit, but you want them to provide like steady long-term employment for more and more people as a company grows, rather than sort of have the money funneled out and spent on handling debt, basically.
I mean, the big here and in England, I think, there's a big progressive move to tax share buybacks. I'm not necessarily against that, by the way. But like those share buybacks are negative because you're not using the cash for something constructive except for lifting your stock. But buying a company with debt and paying less in taxes, that's okay. To me, just seems at least share buybacks should help the stock, should help shareholders.
Mm-hmm.
You could argue they should do something better with the money, or at least pay a tax on it. I get that argument, but they're ignoring the giant argument in the corner.
Okay. So I was hoping we could go into like a little more detail in terms of like the damage that you think that these companies have done. So so how much damage do you think that the leveraged buyouts and private equity firms have done to the economy over the past sort of 30, 40 years?
It's a little hard to clearly quantify it, but because they own companies employing 1 out of every 10 Americans, Again, the number wouldn't be quite as large in England, but it's large. I don't know what it is. I never really dug into it, and the studies haven't been done by academics to show, but I'm guessing it's not that far off. But here, I certainly think that there is a lot of evidence. When we, in the pandemic, when a lot of retailers went bankrupt, a good percentage based on studies not done by me, more than half were owned by private equity firms. And it was clear they were completely unprepared because when earnings even took a dip, well, there's no cash reserve. You owe all this money. So these companies went bankrupt. Since you brought up Bain before, a Toys R Us that used to be owned by Bain, then it became owned by KKR. But a Toys R Us, for example, moved slowly into the internet space because that takes money. They actually outsourced it for a time to Amazon, if you can believe it, and and they busted out. But during the recession, there were a lot of companies that ended up going bankrupt. A lot of retailers, and roughly half were owned by private equity firms. And it's just another example of how any change in earnings, a slight dip, and there was more than a slight dip in the early months of the recession, and they just don't have the wherewithal to withstand it. So these are essentially weak companies. So most private equity-owned companies, to be fair, do not go bankrupt, but they are zombie companies. Typically, they are not investing in technology. You know, it's just because I just wrote about it. It's an ON Semiconductor losing the contract to make chargers for Apple because a newbie came along that using a different technology that has smaller chargers and uses less electricity. And good decision by Apple, but why wasn't the private equity-owned company doing that? There's a large company owned by private equity called First Data in the credit card business. Square came out of nowhere and advanced, with technological advances, moved the industry 10 steps forward. Why wasn't First Data doing that? Well, I think the easy answer is, people look into it, A, the company has a lot of debt. B, the company's ownership is looking to buy and sell in 5 years. And 3, the company is run by essentially investment bankers who are now private equity guys who are not thinking long term. They're thinking, how do I increase my cash flow and get out? Is there a widget maker in England or here where that can work? Yeah, of course there is. But that's the minority, and it's a small minority. Typically, private leverage buyouts hurt businesses.
Okay. So you're basically saying that when a company is taken over by private equity, that it is less resilient, kind of unable to handle even small dips in the market, and probably most importantly, that they're unable to invest in new technology, transform themselves as whatever industry they are in changes, evolves. And this is something obviously that's been especially prevalent over the past sort of 20 years as the tech space has sort of transformed so many industries. So you're saying that this has caused a lot of these huge retailers like Toys R Us to basically fail to move forward as the industries have gone because they have no money in reserve to spend.
Exactly, or very little. Like just because I just wrote about it very recently, Topps baseball cards. So I don't know, in England, you guys might not care about our boring sport of baseball, but Topps baseball cards are a tradition in America. Private equity firm Madison Dearborn owned Topps for years. Didn't do so well with it, but just kind of like Major League Baseball will keep using us to make cards. Well, then Fanatics came out of the woodwork. Fanatics based here, but global, growing as fast as anything. Goes to Major League Baseball around the back of Topps. Says, "Hey, Major League Baseball, we'll cut you in. The players will get an ownership of the company. We're going to move forward with NFTs. We've got all these great plans. We're going to have a role in online gambling. The Topps contract is coming up. Throw them overboard." And Major League Baseball, which is usually pretty old school, did. And suddenly Topps, that was going to go public through a SPAC, that SPAC ended up canceling their deal. This is all within the last month or two. And Topps is in real trouble. And it's a perfect example of a private equity firm laying on its laurels, not looking forward. I spoke to people for the story, who were very close to the situation and not at Fanatics. And I looked at the financials. Tops was investing $1 million a year in R&D. They were generating $500 to $600 million in revenue. They weren't doing much. In fact, one of the pitches of the CEO of Tops, who was going to join the SPAC and keep running Tops, was, now we'll be free to spend money. Well, he didn't have time. The industry caught up with him. And I think industries, life, technology catches up with a lot of companies that end up passing private equity firm-owned companies by. But you know what? The buyout firm that owns Tops took out a giant dividend from their company, had the company borrow more money to pay them a giant dividend. They're going to make money regardless. I'm sure they don't like what happened, but they win anyway. But if you worked at Tops, this would stink.
Yeah.
If you worked at Tops, you might now lose your job. Tops is in real trouble. Props to Fanatics, but again, it hurts a very iconic U.S. company.
I mean, I guess the one part of my brain is saying, well, at least this is encouraging sort of new companies to try and come in and disrupt the space and push technology forwards in ways that perhaps larger companies wouldn't be able to. But then, I mean, it's a very callous way for one side of my brain to think about it, because these are people's jobs and livelihoods and careers that we're talking about. And they can't just easily jump from one to the other. And even if they can, there's that period of uncertainty. They might lose, especially in America, they might lose their health care. It's kind of, it seems that even if that is encouraging innovation in a way, that it's making the world very unstable and uncertain for large parts of the market and for people trying to navigate the job market.
It does provide opportunity, but generally there's such a big part of our economy. I think it's generally bad news, and I guess it's not the theme I thought I'd be talking about, but I guess a guy like Jonathan Rubin, who owns Fanatics, I think it's Jonathan Rubin for sure. But anyway, he also owns a piece of the Philadelphia 76ers. I think guys like that, again, as a reporter who tends to be on the critical side of things, I think we ought to, in the press and in the investment community, look at these guys critically, but they're building something. There's also a part of me that respects that. There's part of me that respects, since we've spoken about GameStop, the GameStop shareholders who are trying to learn about GameStop and are not relying on analysts and hedge funds. Whether in the end it makes sense or not, I don't know, but at least they're trying. As opposed to private equity guys who typically don't like, they wouldn't like a guy like Rubin. In fact, I've been told this directly. I mean, they want CEOs who say, yes, sir, no, sir. I'll provide weekly updates on EBITDA, profit numbers, and we're going to stick to the numbers and we're going to stick to the script. That's not very entrepreneurial. In my view, it is a way to make money if you're the PE firm, but it's not very entrepreneurial, and it's really bad for our economy. And they happen to pay a lot less in taxes as well.
Thanks for making it all the way to the end of the video. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment for us in the comments below. Let me know what you thought and if you'd like to see more of this from the show. Thank you, and we'll see you again next time.